Okay, now it's time to sew. Remember, we're not sewing in the traditional order of construction. We will sew as many pieces as possible before stopping to press. In this lesson, you'll learn to sew without pins or basting to maximize efficiency. I'll explain why we avoid pressing seams under 1/4 inch for safety and accuracy. And I'll teach you which piece to lay against the feed dog, because that's very important, and you'll get the best results. I have taught several classes here on Craftsy called Sew Better, Sew Faster classes, where I go into great depth about how to sew without pins and many of the nuances. But I'm just going to give you a brief tips right now. The first one is the best way to sew, I would not sew any other way, is to have a flat surface around your machine, just like I have. So this one is sunk into a custom-made table. You can make tables very inexpensively. Do this for yourself. You can purchase a cabinet. But if you don't have the space or the wherewithal for the big cabinet, then you could purchase extension tables, and they're clear plexiglass usually, and you can have it made for any machine. So it doesn't matter what machine you have, you can get an extension table made for it. Then you want to always be sitting where your elbows are at a 90-degree angle. You'll be more comfortable, you'll be able to sew longer and get better results as well. So when you sew without pins, it's important to understand what the feed dog are doing. The feed dog are coming up and they're in contact with the bottom layer of the fabric, and they're moving it through the machine ever so slightly faster than the top layer is going. So in effect, if you sew 9 inches without using pins or holding the fabric properly, you're going to lose about 1/4 inch on the bottom layer. So if you've ever taken 2 pieces of fabric, it's a long straight seam, and you think, hey, I'm not going to use pins, I can sew this seam, and you sew it and you keep all the layers of fabric together, but when you get to the end, you probably found that you were missing quite a bit on that bottom layer. Some people don't understand why this happens. No one's ever explained it to them. So oftentimes I hear they just cut the top layer off to match the bottom layer. That's not a good idea. First of all, you've eased that bottom layer to the top layer, so that seam is going to be just a little wonky and never really lay as flat and nice as it should. So you do want to keep those 2 layers exactly as they were cut when you sew them. So I'm going to show you how to hold the fabric so those pins aren't necessary. Normally you're pinning and you think, I'm pinning so the fabric won't slide back and forth. And that is one of the reasons that you pin, but the other reason is to keep that feed dog from taking the bottom layer through faster than the top. The problem is that unless you have a pin every 1/8 of an inch, it's happening between the pins. So if you're a pin puller, which means as you're sewing along and you come to a pin, you pull it out, you're letting go of what's happening there so it continues to ease. So chances are you're still ending up a little shy when you get to the end of the seam. If you're a pin hopper, which means you sew over the pins, you probably will notice in certain fabrics you'll effectively get a little pin tuck, which is that little tuck right next to the pin, because that bottom layer is easing and you're not doing anything to prevent it. And so pins aren't exactly doing all of what we need to do. And I'm going to show you how you don't even need the pins and you can get better results. I've got 2 strips, 36 inches long, and these are 3 inches wide. I really suggest that you try a few attempts at this, and once you feel comfortable with it, then you can move on to your shirt. And it really, trust me, it doesn't take very many times. When I teach this in live classes, almost everybody gets it the first time. So it's really simple, but just make sure they're the same length when you start. Start with a nice firmly woven cotton. So the first thing we do is we'll stick the fabric underneath the foot and sink the needle, drop the foot. Now I'm going to do a 1/4 inch seam here, but you notice that I didn't start at the very edge of the fabric. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is I do want to back tack or fix that seam so it won't come undone. So you always do a little reverse stitching. But if I go back and forth too many times, especially if it's a finer, lighter fabric like a lawn, I'm going to put too much thread and too many stitches in one area. And instead of counteracting a stress point, I've created a stress point where the fabric's liable to rip away eventually. So I don't want to go too many times over. The other reason is that many of you are sewing on machines that have a very long, narrow hole in the throat plate for the needle to pass through. And the reason you have a long, narrow one or a wide one is because you have zigzag on your machine. So sometimes you're zigzagging, so you have to have that big hole. Well, then, if you start on the very edge of the fabric, you may have noticed that sometimes it just sucks that fabric right down into that hole. Now, in the machine I'm using, I have a straight stitch plate on here, which means the hole is not a rectangle shape. It's just a little tiny hole, just slightly larger than the needle. So now the fabric can't get sucked down in there. If you have a machine that did not come with a straight stitch throat plate, contact your sewing machine dealer and find out if there is a straight stitch plate made for that machine. And in most cases there is, and you'll be able to get it. The only thing is once you put it on, you need to remind yourself you can't switch back over to zigzag, because you'll definitely have a problem and probably break the needle if you do. Okay, so let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is just back up to that edge and then come forward. Now I'm using 3 for my stitch length, and in most garment constructions that's what we use, is a 3. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that we want, when we go turn the garment around and we're doing a top stitching, we want those stitches to lay nice and look pretty on the top of the fabric. The smaller the stitch, the tighter the stitch, the less it's obvious that it's top stitching. It just sort of creates a groove in the fabric. So before you start sewing your project, remember the test piece that I showed you how to make? Use that and test the different stitch lengths. You might even want to go a little bit longer than 3. So test that out before you get going. All right, I'm going to do a 1/4 inch seam here because a lot of what I sew is 1/4 inch seams, but it doesn't matter what width your seam allowance is, the system will still work. And again, this is industry sewing techniques. This is the way they sew in the garment factory. This is tried and true. This isn't something I made up. It's not a gimmick. It really works. So you're going to come back, and this is one of the reasons we need a nice flat surface in front of us, because we're going to come back as far as we can and find maybe the first notch. Now on this strip I don't have notches, I don't need them, but I'm going to come back here and put my thumb under, fingers on top, and tilt the fabric at about a 90-degree angle toward the machine. Okay? Thumb under, fingers on top, tilt. This is my only pin between my finger and my thumb, holding that fabric. I'm not letting the fabric slide between my finger and thumb. I'm holding it. So this is my only pin. So then when I tip it forward and I hold it that way, the bottom layer absolutely cannot go through faster than the top layer. It's as simple as that. Now your left hand is very important in this process as well, because the left hand is going to come down on the fabric with your pads of your fingers, pressing ever so slightly on those 2 layers of fabric so they don't shift back and forth. But it also is going to help guide the fabric through at the proper seam allowance. So the left and the right hand are working together. So they're both going to come back as far as you can, thumb under, fingers on top, tilt, and then just stitch. And we're going to stitch right up to the foot. The left hand does not ever pass the needle. It's not necessary, and if you're one of those many people who sews pulling the fabric through the machine like this, well, first of all, you don't need to pull the fabric through the machine. That's what the feed dog are for. Secondly, your posture and your whole working process is causing more stress, and you're pulling forward. You need to be able to sit up straight and be comfortable. So it'll take a little practice. The longer you've been sewing that way, the longer it's going to take you to change your habits. But trust me, once you do, you will never go back. This is the best way to sew. So then I'm just going to come back again, and I'm going to stitch right up to that foot, come back again, and I can get this in about 3 to 4 goes. You see, this is the way they sew in the garment factory. They don't sew like home sewing where we go to-din, 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 we watch it go through. They sew in short, fast clips like this. It's more efficient, it's more accurate, and it's just a whole lot easier. When I get to the end, it's very hard to have that bend in the fabric. So I just hang on to it the best way I can, and by the time I get to the very end, I just push my fingers down and hold it. So as you can see, we've got both pieces in, and it was just that easy. And again, trust me, one time and you're gonna have this down, maybe a second time just to confirm you've got it right, but it's really, really easy. And that's how we're gonna put our project together. So we'll start with the right front. Now the right front, remember we put a 2 1/4 inch piece of interfacing in here, and we folded it and pressed it on the fold line. Now we're going to turn under a 1/4 inch and top stitch or stitch this down. Before we do that, because we don't want that bottom layer to go through faster than the top, we're going to hold it properly. But just to make sure that we're on track, we're going to make some registration marks here so that we don't get all the way to the end of the seam to find out that we've tweaked our whole placket. So I just take a gel pen or chalk, whatever works on that fabric. And remember, test it before you put it on the fabric. I've had some big disappointments myself when I didn't stop and think about that. So what you want to do is just every 6 to 8 or 10 inches is make a horizontal line across your placket right onto the shirt. And I'm going to come down and make another one. And you could use a ruler if you like, but you do want to make sure that they're very straight and even. And then we'll use those as our registration marks to make sure we stay on track. So we're going to come up here, and I think you'll notice that I'm using a contrasting thread, and that's just for your benefit so you'll be able to see it. I really wouldn't use neon thread on a light blue shirt. Anyway, we're going to turn that under a 1/4 inch. We'll lay it under the foot and put the needle down to hold it in place. Now again, remember how I always say stripes are your friend? You can tell if you're folding it under the same amount from one end to the other because it's going to lay in the same place on those stripes. But remember, thumb under, fingers on top. So I've got to get underneath this shirt and grab a hold of it. And then I'm going to just stitch down to the first mark. And here we're going to be stitching a needle width away. And a needle width away is just like it sounds. It's the width of a needle from the edge of the fold. So once you get to the first registration mark, then you stop with the needle down. And hopefully you have a machine where you can set it to always stop with the needle down. The reason for that is because we're always going to be stopping and readjusting. And if we readjust and we don't have the needle down, we could slightly misalign our stitching. So every place you stopped, you'd have a stitch out of place because you wouldn't be in exactly the same place when you start up again. So this is the best way to do it. We don't press under a 1/4 inch because, first of all, you're likely to stretch the fabric out. By pressing that little tiny amount, you're holding it and trying to press it down. It's problematic, and I usually would burn the tips of my fingers. So I find that for 2 reasons I don't do that. But it's very accurate. You've cut this on the straight of the grain. You have a nice woven fabric. And you shouldn't have any problem whatsoever turning that under. At first, if you want to practice because you're not that comfortable with it, go right ahead. But again, like I said, you won't get out of line because you've got stripes. So once I have those stripes, I know they're my friend because they'll keep me right on track. Thumb under, fingers on top. Remember that every time. And you see how I have these marked every few inches. So if I did kind of slip and let the bottom layer go through faster than the other, all I have to rip back to is the previous mark. I don't have to go all the way back and start over again. I mean, that's what we make stitch rippers for, and we all use them. Okay, so just carry on all the way down. So we've stitched down the right side, all done, needle width away. Now we're ready to do the left side. Now remember on the left side, we pressed it, folded it over twice. So I want you to really pay attention because I don't know why, but it seems to be the instinct of some people to do the stitching on this inside fold. That's not where we want to stitch. We want to stitch on this outside fold. And we're going to stitch 1/4 of an inch. So just line it up with your throat plate, and hopefully your throat plate has 1/4 of an inch on it, or possibly you could have a foot that was 1/4 inch foot, which means right along the edge. If you line that edge along the fabric, you'll have 1/4 of an inch. If you don't have either one of those things, you can always do a little measuring and put a piece of painter's tape to create that 1/4 inch seam allowance. So again, never stop putting thumb under, fingers on top. And even if you use pins, let's say that you're not ready to completely give up those pins and you want to put 2 or 3 in. Even if you put the pins in, please start using this technique with your hands and always hold it this way. You'll be really, really happy with the results. So as you can see, I know my 1/4 of an inch is practically right down the center of this stripe. So it's even easier for me at this point to know where I'm stitching. Don't ever try to gauge your stitching by the needle. If you're watching that needle, you're going to have more problem getting straight seams. You really want to use the edge of your foot or your throat plate as your guide, and you'll get more accurate seam allowances that way. You may have noticed that I'm not picking the foot up back here, going back and forth. It's because this sewing machine has a knee lift. And most of the new machines that have come out in the market in the last couple years are starting to provide the knee lift, because home sewers have started to realize what a great tool that is. Some of you may even have one and thought that it was an alternate power to the foot. Instead of having a foot pedal at the bottom, you would use the knee. There were some machines many years ago that were built to do it that way, but that's not what these are for. This is a knee lift. It's a little L-shaped bracket that comes out of the machine down by my knee, and I just push with my knee every time I want to go up and down, and I don't have to stop to lift this up. So now, well, let me show you this so you stay right with me. Okay, that's when we double folded. We stitched 1/4 of an inch. Now bring this out. And as you can see, magically, I think, I love this placket. When I discovered it, I thought it was the best thing. Because now, this is our placket. It's already made, folded, everything, and all we have to do is do 1/4 inch stitching down the outside now, and our placket will be done. And there couldn't be an easier way to make a placket. And I want you to notice how I'm able to sit up straight, and I'm able to be very comfortable at the machine. And it's all about those ergonomics I talked about. And it'll make so many projects easier to sew. And having this flat surface allows that, as you can see, the project just glide right around. It's not pulling away from me. And once the project keeps getting bigger and bigger as you add more pieces, it starts to have some weight to it. And if you're sitting with your machine on top of a table and you have just a small surface right here, you're having the drag all the time. And if you're having trouble in getting snake tail kind of trail seams, it could be one of the reasons. And this might just change your world by having that flat surface. Okay, so, and again, we're doing a lot of this out of order, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to stitch the collar. We're not ready to put the collar on, but we're going to get it ready. So we have one piece with the soft interfacing, one piece with the firm interfacing, and we've cut the tips out of the interfacing, only on the collar, just the tips. Now we're going to stitch this together with 1/4 inch seam allowance. And because we know what the feed dog do, there's a rule. What piece goes against the feed dog is very, very important when you're sewing. In all the steps in my pattern guide, if there is important, I tell you which piece to put against a feed dog. And the general rule is the softest, the loosest, the most biased, the most difficult to handle goes against a feed dog. So in this case, it's not a huge difference, but one piece has soft interfacing, one piece has firm. So I'm going to put the soft piece against the feed dog. Again, it's not as big a difference here as it is in some of the other areas. We'll discover in a few minutes. Okay, so we're going to back up. Now, When you have a very severe point on a collar like this one is, it's very difficult to get a sharp point on the collar. So for this particular project, I'm going to do a little trick that I often do with points of collars. Now there are lots of different workarounds. This isn't the only way to do it. But I'm going to come down just shy of what would be the 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'll turn this, see, and it's a little more than 1/4. And then I'm going to stitch 1 stitch over. Then continue on the 1/4. There are lots of ways to accomplish a point on a collar, and if you have a better way, by all means do it. I will tell you that what's in style now is a spread collar, and on a spread collar you don't have anywhere near as severe a point. In that case, I would go right straight down to the 1/4 inch seam allowance and turn the corner. Okay, so we're just going to come across here and remembering to hold it with thumb under, fingers on top. Okay, so now we have the collar ready to put away until we're ready to press. And our next step is to put the darts in the back. If you're doing the women's, this is the time you put the dart in the front. Okay, so in the back, we've marked our darts. You want to make sure this is where I've got it marked wrong side, because I almost did the right side. This is so, especially when you're in your studio working at night and you just don't notice it. One time I sewed half a garment all inside out because it was dark and it was black and I thought I had the right side and I didn't. So what I did, when I marked this dart, I used my gel pen and I marked the tips of the dart, and then I found about the center and made also marks directly across from each other to help keep me on track. Now I'm going to fold this, and if you'd like to use a pin, this is where you might want to use a pin, just by poking through this little dot and making sure that you've got these dots right across from each other. And that's where we're going to start sewing. Instead of sewing from one end to the other, we're going to start in the middle. And we'll stitch right on that, where that red dot was, and then I'm going to come and find the end of my dart, which is down here. What I want to do is aim for that end, but as I get to that end, the last place I want to stitch is right on that fold, and then I'm going to stitch right off of it. If you're not comfortable and you don't have a lot of sewing experience, you could go ahead and draw that sewing line in. Just use a ruler and a removable marker of some type that you've tested. So I'm going to come down here, and when I get right to the end, I want to be right on that fold, and then I'm going to stitch right off. So you see that? This has all stitched the thread together, so it's all knotted up. It's not going to come undone. Probably don't need quite that long of a tail, but I wanted to make sure you could see it. In the industry, this is the way they always put darts in. You may have been taught to put a dart in and then go back and tie those threads together. And of course that'll work, but it's not necessary. I've been doing it this way for many, many years, and I've never had a dart come out, but give it a try. I think you'll be pleased. Now I'm going to come back to the center again, and I'm going to go over the previous stitching by maybe 3 or 4 stitches so that they're locked together. And I'll just come down to the other end and do the same thing. And I have to start in the middle so that I can stitch right off again. Otherwise, I wouldn't have that opportunity. Okay, and then you'll put the second dart in. There's 2 darts in the back of the man's shirt, and that's just to create a nice silhouette and to bring some of that shirt in so it isn't blousing over on the waist. We're going to put the yokes on, and I'll tell you, I haven't put the pocket on yet, and in your pattern guide it'll say to put the pocket on. So I'm going to go back and do that in a minute, and it really doesn't matter what order you do these things in at this point, so I'm not going to worry about it. All right, so we're going to take our back, and we want to start with the wrong side. And it really doesn't matter, but I'm going to, because this is the way we wrote in the directions. And then we're going to put the right side of one of our yokes. Remember, you cut 2. And sometimes one looks a little bit better than the other. You might want to just examine them and take the pick of the litter and make that your yoke that's going on the outside that faces the public. Again, stripes are our friend. So what I do is I just cut along one of the stripes and then I lay my pattern piece on that. And then I know I have a straight across a stripe, so it isn't going to look wonky when I sew it. Now, a professional shirt maker would do both of these yokes at the same time. They'd sandwich the two together. But I always teach it as a two-step process just so that you can have an opportunity to try it and it'll be less clumsy at first. So we're going to sew this first seam at 1/4 inch. Our finished seam is really 3/8. But I'm going to sew this first one at 1/4, so when I sew the second one on at 3/8, I don't have to worry about being spot on to that 1/4 inch. Because if I sewed them both at the same, chances are you'd see some stitching on the right side because nobody's perfect. And I'm not going to get it right on in every single stitch. So in the back, we've made those clips that I talked to you about that are just a little, substitute for notches. So I want you to see here how nicely those match up. There's no guesswork at all. I know exactly I'm spot on. So I'm going to grab those, thumb under, fingers on top. And what you'll notice, and different shirt patterns have a different amount of ease in the back when you're sewing it to the yoke. And some will curve way out. But this one is just a little bit out there. What I'm going to do to bring that easing in is I'm going to put my left hand underneath, and with my fingers I'm going to pull that fabric back just like that until it's even with the top layer. So I just do this and pull it in. Pull it in. So I'm going to pull it in as I stitch. The feed dog are doing the work of easing for you. And that's why it's so important to know about the feed dog action. Because so many times, sewing techniques that some people employ are setting you up for failure and they don't even realize it because you're fighting the feed dog instead of working with the feed dog. So in this case, we know we're working with the feed dog. It's going to pull that ease in for us. And again, we're going to sew this at 1/4, but you could sew it at a little bit less. It doesn't matter as long as you stay at the 1/4 or less. Then we'll put the primo yoke right side against the right side of the shirt. So we have this one's our facing that we just put on. Now we're going to add the actual yoke that's going to face the public. And again, we're going to sew this one at 3/8. And it's pretty much the same concept, except for the easing has already been done to the first piece. So mostly you just have to almost put it on wrong side. This fabric is beautiful, but you do need to stay conscious of the fact that the right and wrong side look very much alike. Okay, so we're going to sew this one at 3/8. I always mark the centers of the center front and the center back of anything I sew, even if it's somebody else's pattern and they haven't created that mark for me, I just do it because I can stay right on track. And again, if I get halfway across this yoke and those notches don't match, I can go back and fix it before I've sewn the whole seam. Nobody likes to rip the stitches they just put in, so if I'm going to have to rip, I want to rip the least amount possible. Okay, so now our yoke is sewn onto our shirt. Now, I'll put the pocket on the left front for you now. Traditionally, in your pattern guides, the way they do a pocket is they'll take the pocket and they'll fold it on the hemline, the fold line for the hem, and they'll stitch it down on both sides. Then you'll turn it right side out and most likely press it. The problem with that is, and you probably noticed it, is that it creates a kind of a little problem area at the top of the corner of the pocket. And when you finally stitch through it with your needle, it kind of goes kerclunk, and it maybe messes up your tension or throws the stitch off ever so slightly. In the garment industry, they just do it the way I'm going to show you. So first of all, remember we have it all pressed. So now we're going to hem this side. And again, we're going to turn that 1/4 inch under without pressing it first. And we're going to stitch it a needle width away from the folded edge. Now again, stripes are your friend, because guess what? You can't tweak this because you'll make sure the stripes match as you stitch it across. Okay, so now we're just going to stitch this across. Okay, so now we got our hem in. Now we're just going to find the marks that we put on the shirt, the left front. And in this case, this shirt only has one pocket. It's on the left. You could add, if you wanted to double pocket for some reason, you could put a second pocket on the right side. That's often seen in shirts. Or you can skip the pocket altogether, which is also totally acceptable. So now I'm going to turn this under 1/4 inch and get it lined up where it's supposed to go. And again, I've cut this so the stripes will match. And if you're ever so slightly off and you've got to move your pocket 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 inch to the right or the left to get those stripes to match up, it doesn't matter. As long as the pocket is in generally the right location is all that it's important. So I'm going to start at this corner, and I'm going to stitch all the way around the pocket, and then I'm going to come back around and do a double top stitching. I like double top stitching on pockets because I think it makes them far more secure, specifically if they're going to be used. Many people will do what's called a reinforcement at the corner, and that's perfectly fine too. So if I was going to do the reinforcement, I'll give you a little tip. I would start right at the stitching at the hem, a needle width away from the edge, and stitch up. Let's say you're going to do the triangle. So you'll stitch up at a slight angle till you get to the top. Then you'll stitch over until you get to that needle width away, but you'll count those stitches. And it's generally 2 to 3 stitches across. You want to count those stitches because you want the triangle on this side to look the same as the triangle reinforcement on the right side of the pocket. And then when you get up here, you can count those stitches, angle toward that hem, and be assured that your reinforcement triangles are going to look very much alike. Let's get started here. I'll get this turned under 1/4, get it lined up where I want it, and thumb under, fingers on top. We don't want to ease our shirt to our pocket. I'm going to come about halfway down and stop with the needle down. And then I'm going to turn this under 1/4 inch. I want you to see what I did right here. I marked this at 1/4 inch by using my little yellow ruler. So I used this little plastic ruler, and I marked 1/4 here, and I marked 1/4 here, just so that I get a really precise angle and nice point on that pocket. I don't want any guesswork when I get down there, or my pocket will be asymmetrical. And I don't want that. Okay, so I make sure my stripes are going to match up. I get my corner turned under, hanging on to both layers of the fabric. Come down until you get a needle width away down in that corner. Now sometimes to hit precisely on that edge, you may have to, that last stitch, you want to go one more stitch, but that's going to take you off the pocket. Just go ahead and dial your stitch length down to maybe a 2. Take that little stitch, then dial back up to a 3, and you're ready to go. So we're going to come down here and we're going to fold, and see, I'm going to use those red marks just to keep me on track at this point. Get those lined up under there. Now I did not starch this pocket, but I'll tell you, if you starch the pocket, it'll be easier to handle. Now this is really important that you don't pull on that pocket, and the reason is that the bottom of that pocket that's coming to a point like that, it's bias, and if you give it any kind of tension at all, you're going to end up with a curve, not a pleasant looking curve on the bottom of your pocket. And if that happens, now you'll know why. And again, if this is your first time sewing without pins, by all means, cut an extra pocket out of the same fabric and a scrap of fabric and sew one on a scrap of fabric first so that you make sure that you're going to be right on when you do it on your project. Okay? Now I'm just going to go up this side. Almost done here. Make sure everything's going to line up. Now when I get up here, like I said, I'm going to double top stitch this. So I'm just going to come over a couple of stitches. The second top stitching I want to do is about 1/4 of an inch away. And I know some pattern guides will tell you they'll do a 5/8 inch seam allowance in the pocket, and then they'll tell you to top stitch it 1/4 of an inch away. Nothing screams homemade faster than a pocket put on like that. When you stitch a needle width away, you've made that pocket more a part of that shirt, and it's going to hang with that shirt. When you stitch only 1/4 of an inch away, those edges of that pocket are loose and can curl up a little bit, just enough to show that that pocket really just seems to be not really part of the shirt. It's just sort of stitched on there, and it just looks homemade. So what I want to do is, this foot is narrow, so I want that narrow edge of that foot to lay right against that previous stitching. And now all I have to do is go all the way back around and stop at the top where I began. All right, now it's time to do the shoulder seams. So I've got the back here and the 2 yokes like we sewed them together, so everything's set. But before we do our first stitch of the shoulder seam, I want you to take the facing part of the yoke and fold it back underneath the shirt, because we're only going to be sewing to this piece at first. And I know I've double checked, I've got the right side up. Now I want to put right sides together, so I'm going to put the right front, right sides together. And then the left front. And I always do this, and I always double check, because there's too many options to get them twisted around and make a mistake. And that's another good reason to have a nice big table flat surface, because I can lay this right out and I can make sure my orientation is correct. And now we're going to sew the shoulder seam. Now this is going to be sewn twice, very similar to the back yoke to the back, where we're going to sew twice across this seam. So the first one we want to be shallower than the actual seam allowance. So the actual seam allowance on the shoulder is 3/8, but we're going to stitch this at 1/4 or under 1/4. And never forget to hold it thumb under, fingers on top. Now remember, this is at a slight bias, so don't stretch this. It should lay really nice together, and as long as you hold the other end, it won't creep on you. You won't be easing the bottom to the top or anything. Now when I get right about here, I'm going to back up a couple stitches. Now I'm just going to set this seam, and people call this chain sewing, but rather than stop and start, I'm just going to go from one to the other. Definitely going to back up, and then we'll just stitch across this one as well. Now all we have to do is just clip this thread in between, and that shoulder seams are done, okay? So there we have it, slightly less than 1/4 or 1/4, but certainly not the full 3/8. Now, here is the facing, the yoke facing. We want to sew this to this. So the way we're going to do it is I'm going to wrap that around, and this is one of our burrito techniques. So instead of having to do what a sewing pattern might teach you to do, is come up here, turn this under, and hand stitch it down, we're going to do it all by machine. And hand stitching never holds as well as machine stitching. There's a wonderful place for hand stitching. It's usually in couture sewing. And I don't have anything against hand sewing, except for when it's not necessary and it won't be as high a quality of seam. So we're going to take this, and I'm going to spin these around, okay? And I'm going to bring that other side of the yoke over so that these line up. So this is the facing, this is the yoke. This is the facing, this is the yoke and the shoulder seam that we already stitched. So now we're just going to stitch the same seam again, but at 3/8. So once you have them lined up, put your needle down, seal the edge. Now you can get this all lined up nice and neat. Your shirt is all tucked up underneath there. So it seems a little awkward, but actually it's the greatest technique because it'll all be clean finished and it'll be an enclosed seam. And the reason we're stitching it at 3/8 is that many people will want to do some maybe double top stitching. And whenever you top stitch, you want to be stitching through a seam. So we keep the seam allowance at 3/8 in case you want to top stitch at 1/4, you'll have something to bite into. If you only had a 1/4 inch seam, chances are you'd be slightly missing it as you stitched top stitch 1/4 because of the turn of the cloth. All right, so now we have stitched our shoulder seams, and now all we have to do is pull it all back out. And it's clean finished on both the right and the wrong side. Okay, I'm going to do it again just to make sure we all are on the same page. So from the outside of the shirt, wrap it around. Now we'll begin the construction of our sleeve placket. That's the placket that goes up above the cuff, usually has a button or two in it. So we'll start out with the sleeve, and we're going to be stitching from the wrong side first, but I want to make sure that you've cut that rectangle out that the pattern indicated. And then watch carefully as I show you how to do this. We want to make a 1/4 inch line just above that opening. So I've taken my little ruler and I marked it at 1/4 inch, and now with some type of marker I'm going to make a line, because I'm going to clip at each corner at a 45-degree angle up to that red line. And I don't ever do this before I'm ready to sew. And the reason is there's no reason to, and there could be an accident happen and it gets stretched out or something before you get a chance to put the placket on. You want to clip right up to that line, okay? And it's really nice to have a very sharp pointed pair of scissors. Your big sewing scissors that you might use to cut fabric out with, they are not going to be accurately sharp at the point. So the smaller scissors, sometimes they're called tailor points. This is, I'm not sure the name of this one, but I do know the brand is Kai. And it's just got this really nice fine point so you can get in really close. Otherwise, with a big pair of scissors, you're liable to go right through it. So now we've got our sleeve placket, and I've interfaced this one because I did put it on the bias. And let me tell you that if this is your first shirt and you want to make your life easy, don't cut it on the bias. It makes it just a little more problematic because we all know bias does stretch. However, it's a really nice visual element to the shirt. So you decide if you're ready for the bias placket or not. So we're going to sew it to the wrong side first. But I want to sew on this side. So you see how we've left a little hole, no interfacing right here? This is the edge that I want to sew on. And there's a good reason for that. And the reason we left this out, you'll see when we go to fold the placket to make the point at the end, it could get really bulky. So I don't want any interfacing in there, or very little. All right, we're starting with the sleeve upside down, and we're just going to line up the placket on the first edge. And we're going to stitch a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So once you've got it lined up, get that needle down, because that's your third hand. And then you're going to back up, needle down, and get yourself aligned so you can get almost to the very end here. And once we get down there, we're going to open this up. Let me see if I might be a stitch. Nope, I'm right on. Okay, this is good. All right, so now I'm going to stitch by opening that up. I'm going to stitch across at a 1/4. And we want to line up the other end at the 1/4 as well. You just kind of have to inch your way around that end. Come down here. Remember that thumb under, fingers on top. Yep, so we've caught it. Let me turn it over so you can see. And usually you just caught it by almost a thread. So you've just caught it by barely a thread where that clip came in. And the feed dog helped you kind of move that in. So again, you might want to practice that, but it shouldn't take you too long to catch on to that one. Okay, so that's all we do. Do both sleeve plackets, and then it'll be in our homework to get it pressed up before we do the final stitching. So for the homework, get all your shirt pieces sewn together just like I showed you. And in the next lesson, as we continue to build the shirt, I will show you some great pressing tools and techniques, very helpful in making a fine shirt, but also useful in many other sewing projects. I think you're really going to like it.